In 1792, the year George Washington was running for his second term as president, a group of stockbrokers signed an agreement beneath a buttonwood tree at 68 Wall Street in New York City. The resulting organization is today the largest stock exchange in the world, measured by market cap of its listed companies. Duncan Niederauer, CEO of NYSE Euronext, is this week's leader on leadership.
Knowing when to ask for help is critical when you're in a leadership position.
It's getting the best out of people. That's the essence of leadership.
Major funding for Leaders on Leadership is provided by Greenleaf Trust.
Helping people manage their wealth, accumulate assets, and preserve those assets for generational continuity implies trust. We are sitting down on the same side of the desk as you are. We're planning for your financial needs.
Additional funding provided by the Wayne State University School of Business Administration.
Welcome to Leaders on Leadership, here with a student audience on campus at the Wayne State University and Detroit Public Television, Midtown Detroit studio. I'm Larry Fobes. Duncan Niederauer wrote a middle school paper, everything you wanted to know about the New York Stock Exchange, but were afraid to ask. His mother saved it and returned it to him when he joined the NYSE. Thanks for being here, Duncan.
My pleasure.
Now, when you finished your bachelor's degree at Colgate, you didn't go into a business that had anything to do with the stock market. What was that?
My first job out of undergraduate school, I was down in Atlanta being the general manager of a restaurant for an entrepreneur down there. And I guess it was the first of many unconventional decisions that I made, because a lot of my friends who shared the aspiration to end up in the financial services industry were all going to New York to work as analysts for a couple of years. I thought I'd learn a lot more effectively running my own business down there, learn a lot more about customers, about supply chain management, about hiring, and in some cases firing people. And it's a business where most of the businesses fail, so I thought I'd get scar tissue that would be valuable to me later in life.
While you were in Atlanta, you did your MBA at Emory.
I did.
And had an internship with Goldman Sachs. You made a comment in another interview about internships that it's a great opportunity that comes along, and then you spend the rest of your career making the best of it.
Right.
Expand on that.
So what I mean by that is you never know where your opportunities are going to come from. You never know when something's going to present itself, that if you're ready to seize the moment, you can seize the moment. So I applied to 100 different firms. I got 2 interviews, one of which was at Goldman, and shortly after I arrived at the interview at Goldman, because I couldn't figure out why, if everyone else had rejected me, why they were interested in talking to me, it became clear that the gentleman I had sent my resume to, who was not the head of HR but the chief operating officer, had passed my resume to the human resources department. They only interviewed me because they thought I was a personal friend of that gentleman's. And I said to them in my first interview, I said, I've never met Mr. Doty, I don't know who he is, but I did send my resume to him. And I said, if you'd like me to leave, I can leave if I don't want to be here under false pretenses. And they said, no, you came all the way from Atlanta. Why don't you stay here for the interviews? Obviously, I was no longer nervous because I thought my chances were pretty slim. And the first woman who interviewed me was a graduate from Colgate, where I went undergrad. And you can't make that stuff up. Those were all lucky breaks. So I guess the decision to send my resume to Mr. Doty was a fortuitous one, and I caught a break after that.
Then you spent your career unfolded over 22 years at Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
What was the attraction to the whole? Again, you were always involved in the securities side of the business.
Right.
What was the attraction?
I think the attraction was more than what I was working in. What division I was working in at Goldman was the firm at that time gave anyone who was interested in exploring new opportunities, you really had that chance. So I had the chance to start a new business at a very young age in their equities division. Then my wife and I volunteered to move with our now 25-year-old to Tokyo for 3.5 years in the mid-90s. We came back and I had the opportunity to work on where the equities business was going in the next 10 years. And all of those jobs, I think, positioned me later in life to be able to even think about taking something like this. But I always like the markets because you never know what you're going to get every day. And the feedback's pretty instant, and you can't plan too far ahead, and it's always dynamic.
You mentioned the 3-year assignment in Japan. I've known people Americans who've had international assignments in Japan, and they go one of two ways.
Right.
Some of them either try and become more Japanese than a Japanese person, or they try and Americanize the office. Which path did you take?
I must confess, in the beginning, I was definitely trying to Americanize the office. I thought I was sent there to make it more American, at least our office. And I was very lucky that a senior Japanese person pulled me aside and said, "We really like you. You're the first family that seems to genuinely want to be here, and we're excited to have you here, but it's not going to work the way you're going about it." And I'm still grateful to Ueno-san years later for giving me that advice, because we took a completely different approach and we ended up having a lot of success together. And if he had never had the courage to say that to me, it wouldn't have worked.
Then in 2007, you moved back to New York, and you joined the New York Stock Exchange.
Right.
As president and COO.
Right.
Before we talk about your leadership there, help us understand what is the business of NYSE. I mean, for most of us, it's just buying or selling stock.
Right. So as recently as 5 years ago, the NYSE business was really just listing large cap U.S. equities, trading those securities at the exchange, bringing buyers and sellers together. And we thought that for the company to be successful in the long run, it was going to have to be a lot more than that. And what it is now today is an applied technology company with diversified lines of business around the world. Certainly that core markets business that we will never divorce ourselves from. That's at the core of what we do. That's in our DNA. But a large derivatives business, a large technology business, a large post-trade business. We think there's a lot of opportunities for exchanges to participate all along the value chain, not just at the point of sale.
Now, when you're in the Goldman Sachs career, you went up through the organization, had a lot of very responsible jobs. But you were always kind of behind the scenes.
Yes, sir.
When you moved to New York Stock Exchange, suddenly you're in this very public spotlight. How did you handle the transition?
That was an interesting part of the transition, and another one of the breaks I got earlier in my career was one of my bosses, when I was in my late 20s, sent me to public speaking class, even though I wasn't really in a position where I was giving any public speeches. And I was saying to him, I'm grateful, but why are you sending me to this? I don't know what it's going to do for me. He said, "You may not understand for a while, but just go take the course." And so I had done some media in my career at Goldman, but you're right, Larry, it was mostly behind the scenes, right? And this is not your normal public company CEO job, right? You're out in front. There is certainly no curtain to hide behind. You've got to be accessible. You've got to be available most frequently on days when you'd rather not be, because if there's some unrest in the market, you need to be out front, being the voice for people to listen to say, this is what happened today, here's why it happened, et cetera. So that was a big part of the transition, but one that I understood completely what I was getting into.
Now, what you were getting into was a company that was struggling a little bit in 2007 compared to the heyday of the 90s. What was changing that made the whole competitive environment so different?
There'd been big changes on the regulatory side. There'd been big changes in the competitive landscape globally. And I think, like a lot of incumbents who had enjoyed a run for more than 2 centuries at that point, the NYSE was probably a little slow to change. It only became a publicly traded company in 2006.
It's only 200 years.
Right. Most companies wait a little less than 214 years to go public. You're right. They did their first transatlantic merger just as I was walking through the door in 2007. And then I'm asked to take on the CEO job going into 2008, which, as we all know with the benefit of hindsight, was quite a year for a rookie CEO to try to be managing a transformation in the business with the macroeconomic environment being what it was.
Now, when you're making these kinds of changes in the company, you're really talking about changing the culture of the company.
Right.
How do you go about changing, as you said, a very traditional company? The regulatory people are looking over your shoulder. The American investors are looking over your shoulder.
Right,
How do you
right.
know which? How do you get through that?
It is a business that has more stakeholders than almost any company I've ever seen. But I thought the most important constituent group to focus on was the employees. I thought the group of people that were going to help us change it were the ones that I had to spend the most time with. So my view was I had to identify what I meant by the transformational change we had to go through. I had to make it clear, in my opinion, that there were great things about the company. It's one of the best brands in the world. I wasn't going to tear that asunder. At the same time, I had to define for them what the change looked like, what success would look like, and then figure out how to win their hearts and minds to march down the field. And our view, and maybe it's my personal view on culture, it's not about these core values that every company talks about having. If you look at most companies' core values, they're obvious things that we should all live our lives by every day, and people can't identify with them. So we turned that into behaviors. We thought behaviors were much more important, and we tied behaviors around being innovative, being collaborative, engaging with your clients, and just thinking more broadly. And I know it sounds trite, but we're in a global industry. We weren't in an American industry anymore.
As you're making all these changes, innovation's happening at the top of the organization chart, but it's happening happening at all levels as you go.
Right.
How do you encourage people to go out and be innovative at their level, try new things, and not be worried that if it goes wrong, somebody's going to yell at them?
They have to hear that from you over and over and over again, and you have to provide evidence of that. You celebrate successes, but you also celebrate attempts at being successful, whether they were successful or not. And I think people understood that we were going to be very engaged. They understood that we were going to have to take more risks than the company had taken before to go through this transformation, and that basically they weren't going to have to look over their shoulder to see if I was with them or not. If I asked them to take a hill, if I asked them to go in a new direction, they were only going to have to look to their left and right to find me. They weren't going to have to look behind them because I was going to be right with them in the front. And I think if you're going to manage a transformation, you better be accessible. They better know where you are. The people deserve to be able to hear from you on a regular basis. You should over-communicate, and they have to know that you're with them so that the success is shared, but you're there. If there's a failure, I'll take the heat. That's fine. We realize we're not going to transform a company like this without making a few mistakes, and I'll take the heat for those mistakes. That's fine.
The New York Stock Exchange went global with the Euronext merger and a whole lot of other work that you've done. And now you're in the process of merging with Deutsche Börse, assuming regulatory approval comes the end of the year. What are your big leadership objectives to get out of that partnership, merger?
What we're really trying to do is accomplish what others in our industry have not been able to do. Our view is where the industry is going is not just the obvious places like it's going global. It goes back to one of the things we talked about earlier, Larry, which is the business of an exchange going forward has to be a lot more than just that core markets business. What we liked about the Deutsche Börse portfolio as a complementary one to ours is we've got the worldwide leading equities brand. Both we and they have very solid derivatives exchanges. You put them together, it's a nice counterweight to the CME. We're probably ahead of DB on the commercial technology side. They're ahead of us on the data and analytics side, and they've also got a terrific post-trade set of businesses that we were lacking. And I think the combination not only makes both companies more international, but it diversifies the business model in a way that I think will be second to none in the industry globally.
So how's that going? Is that a difficult deal to put together?
It was the most complicated of all the deals that were announced this year, and yet it's the only one that's gotten as far as it's gotten. So some of the other deals that were talked about, LSE Toronto couldn't get the shareholder approval. We had overwhelming shareholder approval. More than 95% of the shareholders who voted on our side and on the DB side both voted in favor of the deal. The NASDAQ ICE hostile approach at us began and ended kind of with a whimper very quickly. And the Singapore-Australia deal didn't get ultimately the political approval and support that it needed to get through. So it was complicated, but nothing that's just game-changing was going to be anything other than complicated. So we knew what we were getting into. We said in the beginning we thought it would take us the better part of the year, and so far we're on schedule.
Does it bother you that you're still progressing when these other ones didn't make it? Are you worried about a rock out there in the road that's going to get in your way?
It doesn't bother me. It's actually a source of pride. I think we have the best team in the industry, and that's why we've gotten as far as we've gotten. I've got an incredibly devoted set of people who understood exactly why we were doing this and what we're trying to accomplish, and the logic from the shareholders' point of view was compelling. And sure, you could always hit an unexpected speed bump, but boy, we've come an awfully long way already. I think that's good. I believe we will see this through.
Thanks for being here, Duncan.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we return, we'll talk more with Duncan Niederauer, CEO of NYSE Euronext. Leaders on Leadership. Joining us today is Duncan Niederauer, CEO of NYSE Euronext, and we're talking about some of his most important leadership issues. Duncan, your leadership style is often described as being straightforward and direct. That seems like that'd work really well in the New York business environment. How's it work when you're out there in the global markets?
I found that one of the key things you have to do as a leader is be yourself. So if I try to go to another part of the world, I certainly have to respect the cultural norms, and I'll do that. I think living overseas and spending as much time as I do overseas is helpful. But I can't turn into somebody that I'm not, or I can't be an actor. I think it's not credible, it's not genuine, and ultimately you're wired the way you're wired, and you have to behave in a manner that's consistent with that. And I actually think it's served us very well. Because for what we're trying to get done, the policymakers that I deal with around the globe, they understand when they sit with me, they're going to get straight talk. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to give them the answers that I think they want. We're going to have an honest dialogue, and I think it helps us a lot, actually.
So the idea, you can't create this leader mystique and perform like somebody in a movie CEO role?
You can't. I mean, if I were going to give a new leader advice, the three pieces of advice I give everybody are: be as flexible as you can be. It's great to have a plan, but if your plan is so rigid that when opportunities present themselves to improve the business, you can't take advantage of them, that's not really leadership, and that's not nearly flexible enough in the environment we live in. The second thing I talk about is it's all of our jobs to leave it better than we found it. Any situation you walk into, whether it's a personal situation, professional situation, if we all just kept thinking of ways to leave it better than we found it, that's the answer to a lot of problems. But the third piece of advice is be yourself. If you're an actor, no one's going to buy it. Your people won't buy it, and your stakeholders won't buy it.
In your job, you spend a lot of time talking to other CEOs around the world, people whose firms are listed on your exchange and others. Mm-hmm. Some feedback from them. In this country, we're focusing on financial reform over the last 2 or 3 years since the meltdown. Yeah. Since things seem to be stabilizing a little bit, there seems to be less talk about it. Are we losing our appetite for financial reform? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know if we're losing our appetite. There were so many changes already made, some of which just the market took care of by itself. And it may be that effort has lost some momentum. But I personally think that what's happened is nothing more than this. Financial reform, what was called for in the wake of the crisis, that seemed to be where most of the re-regulation needed to be focused. I actually don't think that's our problem anymore. I think the problem we've got is we've got stubbornly high unemployment. We've got a situation that doesn't seem to be improving. We've got a situation where SMEs are having a heck of a time getting their hands on affordably priced capital. And that's where we need most of the reform right now. It's not in what's the difference between the OTC market and the exchange-traded market. I think a lot of changes have already been made there, more than we probably think if we took a step back. And now it's about focusing on the economy and focusing on Main Street. I think we've got to get the focus from the policymakers off of Wall Street and onto Main Street, because that's going to be the difference maker going forward.
Another question about when you're out talking to other CEOs, some observations, if you have them. Some of the CEOs you talk to are leading organizations that are skyrocketing, doing very, very well, making all the changes and keeping current. Mm-hmm. CEOs of some other organizations, their places are more stable, more conservative and not doing so well.
Right.
What makes one organization take off and prosper and another one not?
It's just what's in their DNA and it's what's in their culture, right? And we talked about this earlier today at the Detroit Economic Club. In fact, is that the innovation cycle's faster than ever in every industry. So if you used to, if in the old days, if you did an innovation that was game-changing in your industry, that would give you the first mover advantage for an extended period of time. That's no longer the case. Leapfrog strategies are more in vogue. Standing pat in any business is really, really hard. And one of the things we're most proud of is we're about to turn 220. The business has been reinvented multiple times throughout those more than 2 centuries now. And the 21st century is going to call for almost continuous reinvention. It's unsettling. You'd rather manage a stable business. It feels like the foundation isn't underneath you, is not as firm as you'd like it to be. That's the world we live in. That's the world we're expected to lead in now. We really have no choice.
Now, you're also involved in some leadership initiatives that I wouldn't initially have linked to the CEO of New York Stock Exchange. For instance, you're worried about entrepreneurship and small businesses.
Right.
Those are companies by definition that aren't on your board.
Right.
Why are you interested in those?
They may never be on the NYSE, and that's not why we're interested. Our view is that we have a responsibility beyond what the average publicly traded company has, and we are at the core of capital formation. We are at the core of trying to match buyers with sellers, or better said in today's terms, match demand with supply. And it goes back to the point I made earlier about access to affordably priced capital for the Main Street businesses. They're not getting it right now. And what we're trying to do is use our brand, use our imprimatur, use our advocacy platform, if you will, to say to the policymakers, if the main issue is unemployment, let's build a bridge between policy and job creation, which isn't a hard bridge to build, and we're prepared to do whatever it takes in the role we think we can play to help that demand match up with that supply, even if it's not through the conventional channels that those companies have historically been financed through. It may mean that it's time to reinvent the microfinance business in this country, which is a pretty embryonic business in its own right, because those small companies, that's where the jobs are. You get them growth capital, they will build businesses, they will create jobs. That's what the country needs, and yet we see very little of that happening.
You also serve sometimes as an intermediary, if you were a spokesperson for the companies that are listed on your exchange with government agencies.
Right. We do.
When we're in an environment where government can't agree,
Right.
and they seem to be extremely polarized,
Right.
how do you find a path to get between the two polarized groups of government and the business model and find something that works?
The first part of it is we grab the microphone only when we think it's appropriate, but the way we speak on behalf of our community of companies is we will start by saying there's 2,000 to 3,000 companies listed at the NYSE. They are responsible for 30 to 35 million jobs in the United States. That usually will get a policymaker's attention because you realize you're speaking for a broad panoply of big companies, medium-sized companies, and small companies. And remember, that's only the publicly traded companies that are in our community. Then the second thing we try to focus them on is we're searching to find things where they can have bipartisan agreement. And the work we just did to build the on-ramp for small companies to be able to go public and to not have to be burdened by all these regulatory costs until they achieve a certain size is one example of that. The job creation things we were just talking about is another example of that. You can get bipartisan support for some of these initiatives, and it's all targeted to trying to get more capital in the system. We know the money's there. We're just trying to help grease the skids, if you will, to get it into the right places where it can do the most good and have impact on unemployment.
I've got one last question for you, Duncan. You and I were on a panel 2 hours ago with the CEO of Domino's Pizza.
Right.
You're both innovative, long-term companies. Your first career stop was in the restaurant business.
Right.
Let's hypothetically assume tomorrow morning you and Patrick wake up and you've traded jobs.
Right.
What kind of lessons are you going to be able to use from leading NYSE Euronext to leading a global pizza company?
You'd be surprised how much of that would translate over because while Domino's hasn't been around for the 2 centuries we've been around, it has been around for more than 50 years. It is a global brand. It is an applied technology company. You heard Patrick say today they're doing more and more business online. They're one of the largest e-commerce businesses in the world now in terms of number of transactions. So I think a lot of how we manage data, a lot of how we manage how we distribute that data, a lot of how we think about interfacing with the customers, and a lot of how we've built our technology infrastructure, I think would be very applicable. Where I'd be completely out of my depth is a company like Domino's is really right at the coalface with the consumer, and we don't run a business where we're that close to the consumer. I'd have a lot to learn there.
Thanks for being here, Duncan.
Thank you.
Please join us again next time for another edition of Leaders on Leadership. See you then.
Major funding for Leaders on Leadership is provided by Greenleaf Trust.
Helping people manage their wealth, accumulate assets, and preserve those assets for generational continuity implies trust. We are sitting down on the same side of the desk as you are. We're planning for your financial needs.
Additional funding provided by the Wayne State University School of Business Administration. An encore presentation of Leaders on Leadership is available online for viewing at dptv.org.